Okay, sorry about that. Now let me go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, Kris.
Thanks.
Okay.
I just want to say I'm grateful that the parents that are here, but also you all being able to spoke to other parents that may need a little bit more guidance or support or when it comes to eating disorders or disordered eating. I think so often I feel like in my work with parents, also students, that sometimes we go underground, we don't want to talk about it, parents feeling stigma. And so I just want to put that out there that we are here for you, that we want all of you to know that it is something just to ask questions, to inquire, and that as parents to be able to think about what it is for your own child and how we can be able to support your kids, whether it's school or whether it's the treatment pieces that we're going to talk about tonight. So what's interesting for me is I get a chance to work with KW on our youth risk behavior survey. The CDC puts out a survey, and we've been doing it since 2002. And I just want to give you a little taste of a few snapshots of data that might help inform tonight. But please know they are just tidbits. They're informational, and we could get kind of mired in all the data and the pieces and what does that all mean. But the most interesting to me is looking at how our kids are seeing themselves, what they're describing as in the YRBS, that just self-described weight, and how stress is impacting them potentially. So when kids were talking about, a few of them I want to point out is, and I think there was there one right before this?
Let me just show you. There's another one right here next.
That's okay. I can point out some few things, but I think the connection, there was the first one, I just was going to point out that in self-described weight, so when students talked about self-described weight and versus weight management, so they were asked a question about how they would describe their weight with different options, and then also weight management. So how are they potentially manage their weight, if not at all? And when you look at that, and it's in a prior slide, but the 56% of Nutra students feel they are about right versus underweight or overweight. So 56% feel that they're about right. But 79%, when we asked about weight management through the YRBS, it says 79% of Nutra students are trying to manage their weight. So in thinking about that, we have students that may feel, that they're not okay with their body, which is not uncommon. I'm trying to normalize in some ways that what is normal for our own teens, but also recognizing that 79% are trying to manage it. And this is like, we're not going to draw conclusions to it, but we're just pointing out some things that our students really have been sharing with us, thinking about, and for us to think about that when it comes to our programming, when it comes to prevention, tier 1 programming, as well as, supports and how we can build those supports in. And so then the next slide, we talk about really a couple I wanted to point out is weight management and stress impacting functioning. So those students who report trying to lose weight, that they've reported that, and we cross-tabbed it and that with higher rates of stress impacting their ability to function. So of those two questions, we're seeing higher rates of stress for students who are trying to lose weight. And that's probably not surprising. But interestingly, we're able to cross-tab social media and self-described weight, which we're going to talk about social media. And that for those students who are who describe their weight as slightly or very overweight, report higher rates of stress from social media. And then students who are trying to lose weight report 6% more social media stress. And interestingly, we also were able to look at students trying to lose weight have the highest rates of social media use by once an hour or more than once an hour. So recognizing that, the impact of social media can be and has been significant in this population, especially during COVID when everybody was online. And the last thing is really about our mental health data that we're sharing is, and we'll go to the next slide. Okay. Is I think the good pieces out of this is that 31% of our students reported that they're either participating in psych social work services, either in or outside of school. So that there's a third of our students and our families that appreciate getting their kids help and resources to be able to support both their mental health and their well-being. And then the other one that I thought was interesting is 71% of our Nutra students are getting less than 8 hours of sleep. And when we cross-tab that with a number of different factors, those students that reported getting less than 8 hours of sleep are having more impact in stress and anxiety. They have more risk factors that go into their everyday functioning. So it could be substance use. It can be, a number of risk factors that can impact. So I think talking about some very basic kinds of things about health, and we're looking at the whole picture, not just about nutrition, but about thinking about that as holistically about getting students, and thinking about that as your child, getting them supported about how we can get them to bed, what are ways that we can get them the most sleep as possible.
Anything else, Sarah, Kristen, Sejal, that you wanted to add here with just looking at some of these slides and what you know from some of the work that you're doing with youth?
I think, Sarah and I were just commenting as Kris was presenting that I think this data that you're collecting, at some levels, pretty alarming in the sense of thinking about how concerned both folks are about their appearance, which we know is really typical in the period of adolescent development. And is it necessarily like a sign of pathology, comparing yourself to others, comparing yourself to the group that you're around, thinking about, kind of coming into your own sense of self and, who you are developing into as an adult. These are all very normal things to be happening, during adolescent development, but thinking about, 42% of young people skipping meals or cutting calories in some way. And, 1 in 3 kids trying to lose weight in some way. Coupled then when we think about some of these increased, stress and some of the things that you were talking about in the first part of the presentation, and then again, not getting enough sleep. And so it really can compound and create quite a lot of really significant concerns for mental health. So I think, these statistics kind of check from our perspective in terms of what we're seeing in our office and what we see with the clients that we work with. And I think it really speaks to the fact that the young people that we work with are pretty vulnerable. Like this is a time period where there's just a lot going on. And so, things can certainly take a turn, for some folks.
So I just want to remind everyone the chat is disabled, but you can put in the question and answer. So you're able to put questions in there. My apologies. So, one of the things we're going to talk about next is this idea of adolescent development, the key factors and influence. And I know you guys had an image, but I don't have that stick figure image, but do you want to talk a little bit about the psychodevelopmental, social, cultural, and physical influences?
And Denise, just go to the next slide if you can. That will kind of cover what we were thinking about regarding the vulnerabilities.
Oops. Okay. Let me.
Yeah, I was gonna say I like this image a lot, actually.
Perfect. We have it. Great. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? I'm assuming yes. Okay, so talking about kind of what normal adolescent development is like, and also kind of what happens when we are talking about an eating disorder. So adolescence is, and Dr. Desai and Kristen Anderson will go over this a little bit more too, but it's a period of a lot of social, emotional, cognitive growth, as well as physical growth. So not only are we looking at basically just going from a child to an adult, which has its own physical changes, it's also thinking more as an adult. So it is just a vulnerable time period, as Kristen and Sarah were talking about. The way that we think about eating disorders is kind of, or at least there's a lot of different conceptual models out there, but the way that our clinic thinks about it is it's not necessarily something that anyone would choose for themselves. It's more actually a disease of malnutrition or inadequate nutrition for their body's needs because of puberty, which when you combine it with predisposing factors, it's kind of a perfect storm for the development of an eating disorder. So some of the things that can set you up, some of it is even biological. And it doesn't have anything to do with like society or, so genetically they're doing studies, and there's a few loci, like a few places on genes that have been found to correlate with anorexia. There's physiological disposition, like like hunger cues and how aware you are of your bodily sensations and fullness and um, uh, there's a lot of endocrine factors as well. So lots of different things. Some, I think you guys will probably talk about this, Kristen and Sarah, but there's also, temperament. So are you a perfectionist? Are you type A? Are you somebody that's able to delay gratification or like, are you risk averse? Those kinds of things. So then we also talk about other influences. So not just biological, genetic, but of course, I mean, and not also just temperament, psychological, but there is the impact of diet culture. There is the impact of friends. There is like the environment, the social climate is kind of what's listed here that can definitely contribute too. So if you're predisposed to if your teen's brain is predisposed to developing an eating disorder because they have some combination of all of these things, and then you for some reason your teen starts dieting, starts losing weight, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be like they're trying to lose weight. Like some teens, they shoot up and it happens to be the time that they're now also playing sports, so they just happen to lose weight. If you have this vulnerability and now you've lost weight, it kind of becomes a spiral where you lose weight, you're malnourished, your brain isn't thinking clearly, and it's misinterpreting the kind of like the psychological signals that it's getting, and it thinks that it needs to continue to lose weight in order to be happy or to have a good mood, and then you're stuck in the cycle that's kind of on the right here. So the way to get out of it, the way that we think about getting out of it, is just to make sure that your child is nourished and making sure that they're staying on their growth curve. And it's a time of increased energy needs anyways, because you're growing, like you're going from a child to an adult, and you keep growing till you're in your mid 20s. Even if you stop growing in height, like there's still a lot of growth to be had as far as the brain, your organs, your bones. There's bone density that's being built. There's neural connections that are being stabilized, and some are being pruned and some are being developed. I like to use this example all the time. Like I just randomly happen to come across the size of the uterus at different ages, and your uterus doesn't, a woman's uterus doesn't get to the adult size until they're in their early 20s. So we need energy for that growth to happen. So just making sure that your child is getting that level of nutrition to be able to meet those needs.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the sharing now. So when assessing potential concerns, what vulnerabilities might put a young person at risk for developing an eating disorder? And how can a parent recognize the medical, physical, and social emotional signs and implications of body dysmorphia and eating disorders?
Sure. So, Denise, maybe we'll take it in parts. What was the first part?
So when assessing potential concerns, what vulnerabilities might put a young person at risk for developing an eating disorder? Mm-hmm. And how can a parent recognize that?
So, so one of the vulnerabilities which Dr. Danawala talked about was this idea of sort of a genetic predisposition to develop an eating disorder. And one of the things that we often see is these kids do often have perfectionistic traits. So they typically are rule followers. The parents come in and say, this is the kid that we never had, any struggles with before this, that kind of thing. So I think about them as they sort of do everything that they're doing to the 110%, right? And so then someone says sugar is bad, and they are like, I can't ever touch sugar again, right? So it's that some kids hear that message and like maybe they might start eating a little bit less sugar, but they're still going to have whatever. These kids are not going to have sugar at all. So if your kid has that perfectionistic, anxious trait, that is definitely one of the vulnerabilities that we see prior to them having the onset of anorexia, which typically might show up in early or later adolescence. One of the things that we often hear from parents, and to be very, very, very clear, these illnesses can be very, very hard to detect. They really like to hide in plain sight. And if your young person is suffering from an eating disorder, they really do not want you to know about it because they don't want you to do anything about it. The main job of the eating disorder is to stay around. So to be clear, if you are a parent and your young person is suffering from an eating disorder or has been, there's absolutely no guilt or shame in not seeing it sooner. I think we have the benefit of learning a lot from parents because they say things in our office like, oh, in hindsight, when, it was grandma's birthday and Susie didn't have any cake, that was actually telling us something, right? So it's when you start to notice eating behaviors are changing and they're changing in a more rigid way. So this would be, right, like, not only do I not have cake at my grandmother's birthday, but I'm not having it at my sister's birthday, or I don't want it at my birthday, or all of a sudden, even though we have no interest or value as a family about, the environment, I am vegan and, gluten-free, making all of these changes. And the other thing I think parents really can reflect on looking back is a noticeable change in mood, right? So they'll often say, gosh, he or she was so much more irritable, and maybe like a little bit more anxious or snappy with us. A lot of parents will reflect back and notice a big increase in isolation, right? So these kids, maybe they used to be really social and all of a sudden they don't want to go out for ice cream with their friends. And you're noticing that they're spending a lot of time alone in their room. And I think what can be hard about that too, right, is some of that is typical adolescent development, right? You're spending more time in your room. And so I think that's what can be hard. So to be clear, it's not, we never are saying to parents, like, why didn't you notice this sooner? Because it's very, very, very
like
difficult.
The combination of all of these events, right? It's a combination of all these things. And then, Sejal, I know you might talk a little bit about what's happening from a physical standpoint, but it's then also considering, right, are these young people meeting their growth and development needs, right? Are they staying on their growth curves? Are they starting to fall off? If you think about habits like binge eating, where someone's eating really any amount of food, but feeling a sense of loss of control while eating, or getting rid of food in some way, right? By vomiting or using laxatives or diuretics or not eating for a long period of time, like those behaviors aren't typical. So there's no amount of, say, binge eating or compensatory behaviors that we think about as being typical for adolescents. And so if you think about the presence of those behaviors coupled with then some of the things that Sarah is talking about, that's kind of that perfect storm that we would see all together, then typically resulting in obviously some physical concerns like not growing on the growth curve, right? Losing weight, or, losing the menstrual period, or other things. Sejal, I don't want to, or even gaining weight.
I forgot about the menstrual. I think one other point that I want to make is like, this is not like a diagnosis of, like there's some diagnoses in medicine that are quote unquote easier to make, like diabetes, for example. Like you meet the cutoff for the A1C and like one day you're diabetic and maybe the next day you're not. This is more like you may see kind of something happening gradually that maybe make your spidey senses go off. Like, for example, you're, maybe 12 years old and now you've started sports and you haven't changed how much you're eating, but you're getting leaner and you kind of just had a growth spurt, and then you go to your pediatrician for the yearly physical and the pediatrician says, oh, okay, well, the BMI dropped, let's just keep an eye on it. That could be like just an early sign. And I'm not saying that just because that happens, your kid has an eating disorder. It's something to keep an eye on, like maybe looking for some of the behaviors that Kristen and Sarah were talking about, and seeing if those are showing up in your kid. Now, they may not, that's fine. And you may say, okay, you're more active now. You have to have more fuel in order to make your body grow. And your child may not resist that. And that's fine. But if you're getting some resistance, if they continue to like reduce how much they're eating or increase their activity, then that's a problem. And then yeah, some of the other things that you might see is like kind of the list of things that they are willing to eat gets smaller and smaller. That's one thing that I commonly see. Or the portion sizes start getting smaller. And it's just like the caloric needs. I mean, obviously it depends on the teen and how tall they are and what their genetic predisposition, like, you know, if you're what your family looks like. But generally needs more than 2,000 calories a day. Like it could be anywhere from 2,200 to 2,800 calories a day. And that's just for normal teenage growth because you're gaining height and all these organs are getting bigger. So if you're finding like your kid is not getting anywhere near that, then that's a problem. Whether or not it's an eating disorder, it's hard to say, but regardless, your child needs more nutrition.
We mentioned a
Um,
little bit about the girls. Could you mention about boys too here a little bit, with the growth for them and, what are we seeing with boys around
Yeah,
this?
that is a great question. So with girls, of course, you may lose your periods. And so that's kind of meaning like you've gone more than 3 months without a period. With boys, it's a little bit harder to tell. Sometimes their height will drop off. And that's kind of, something that a lot of boys are sensitive about. So they'll notice that their peers are getting taller, but they're not getting taller. That's a sign that they're not getting adequate nutrition. When the pediatrician does the private part exam, they may not be progressing through puberty. Pediatricians look at the pubic hair distribution and the testicles, and if they're not, if they're not growing and developing in the way that they're supposed to, like there's a time course for it, then that may raise some red flags. What else do we see with boys?
Sometimes we
Yeah.
might see with males like a hyper focus on muscularity
Mhm.
or against certain sports. So when we think about things like cross country, wrestling, gymnastics, sports where again size and things like that may be a factor. Those are certainly, although sort of stereotypical in what you hear maybe about eating disorders, I think there is some truth to, again, just sports where kids are burning a tremendous amount of energy, or there's a specific focus on like a certain body type or shape and weight. And that can really affect kids of any gender.
And that kind of leads me to the next one. And Kris, you can help chime in with this one, please. That social media tells us what we should be, what we should look like. There's so much influence over that. And, how can our parents facilitate conversations around social media with their teens? Because, I think there's a part, all of us, we see something, we think that's the ideal image or that's the ideal lifestyle that one would have.
Yeah, I mean, for my work with my students, I find for parents having the conversation, sometimes it's easier to talk about like, what are your peers thinking? What are you seeing on TikTok? What are the things that, are trends? Like, for example, I think just even the male restrictors or the the muscle males trying to gain weight or gain muscle. On TikTok, there's this whole trend of, they're going to restrict certain foods and only have certain foods. So then they start restricting more and more, taking in tons of protein. And there's also, I'm sure Dr. Hummel would suggest or say that there's medical issues that go along with those kinds of decisions around that. So I think just like social media is looking at and finding and thinking about with your kids about what the trends, what they're seeing, what they're hearing. Sometimes when you talk about it, like with, what are your friends, it may be easier and less removed than talking about what are you seeing, but it's always good to be direct too. And look, creating some dissonance, like trying to figure out like, what do you think of those images? What do you know how to interpret those images? What are things that, are your beliefs that you see? What are the things that you might, what is motivating for you? And I think with COVID, what I heard from students and from families is that social media became the place to be able to make connections, to feel like a belonging, a sense of self. And even for myself, when I went on social media and Instagram to stay connected, things that were popping up that I was not searching. There was some really significant things about weight loss. And so I think understanding what kinds of threads that they might be seeing and understanding that piece of it can be really helpful in having those conversations. And then being able to create that psychological discomfort. Like, what is that doing? Do you feel good about when you're on there? I think that the whole Facebook research and data really showed us that social media, the impact of that, while, certainly it can be really helpful, a feeling of connection when you're feeling depressed, but also some students feel like they feel worse afterwards. So I think gauging your kids, gauging what they are getting from it and understanding how it makes them feel, and understanding how they can discern between whether it's a good decision on that day or whether it's something that they can, need to restrict a little bit more for themselves.
So some questions are coming in, and they're coming in around the same thing that I think we were going to get into here very shortly. But, excuse me, for parents, what factors should parents consider regarding words and actions when talking to their child? If they think something is suspicious, just what are you suggesting are ways that they can engage in this conversation with their child?
So I think just to piggyback off what Kris was saying about social media, and then we'll do this two-part, I guess, answer, which is, I think just talking to your young people whenever you can, whether that's like in the car ride or on a walk, or often for young people, it's like right before you want to go to bed or when you're already in bed, which, most parents, including myself, would like to go to sleep. But, again, when your young people want to talk is the time you should talk to them, because they really do actually want to let you in, to their lives. I think there is this sort of myth, that teens don't want their parents to know anything. But I think what we do actually know is that parents scaffolding and providing support, as well as boundaries and expectations, like in a very fair and reasonable way, actually reduces anxiety for young people. That actually there is a developmental, even though you're going to get pushback, if you say, I want you home before midnight, or you're not allowed to drive the car and drink alcohol or something like that, right? You're going to get some, well, my friends' parents let them do those kinds of things. But ultimately, actually, that appropriate boundary setting really, really helps with again, development, and it actually reduces some of the vulnerabilities to mental health concerns and things like that. And so when we think about something like social media, again, I think for us as mental health providers, we are pretty suspicious of social media. So we're not it's no secret to us that we're not always a fan of social media. And we know that young people are using it, right? So I think paying attention to how much they're using it, how they're, just like you were saying, Kris, how they feel when they're done, and also how much what they're viewing is representative of like their world, right? Like, is that consistent with what their peers are doing? Are they finding that they're actually like starting to go down these holes or tracks that really don't actually represent reality? And then also figuring out what they like about it. And I think learning from them and hearing from young people, like, what do they get out of social media that feels positive? Because I think sometimes that's left behind in our conversations where we're talking about all the bad things. But we do want to try to promote that. I think in terms of how to talk to your kids when they're concerned, I think when you're concerned, I guess to say, is I think what's really tricky about that is what we've experienced is if young people really have, especially anorexia nervosa, but eating disorders across the spectrum, they may not be saying to you directly, I want to talk about this and I want help. And so I think, to Dr. Danawalla's point, if you're noticing that your young person is starting to develop some predictable or consistent habits that feel concerning, and then you're intervening and you're not finding that there's behavioral change, right? Like if you're saying, hey, you're playing more soccer, so we're going to start eating an extra snack after school, and your kid is saying, no, I don't eat chips anymore, versus saying like, oh, sure, yeah, I am more hungry. Great. We want to have sort of stepwise intervention. So when you're intervening with like appropriate behavioral changes, you should be paying attention to like, is it working, right? Are these interventions resulting in a change or not? And if they're not, I think often the first step that we recommend is going to the pediatrician, because your pediatrician is obviously usually someone you trust, knows your young person well, knows what normal development looks like, and can start to talk about whether there are some physical impacts. And so that's usually the first step. I think sometimes where we hear from parents, and it's always so stressful for them, is that they're talking to their young person, but their young person is like, I'm fine. You're the problem. Leave me alone.
Don't make a big deal out of it.
Everybody is on a diet, those kinds of things. And I think that's really where, again, from our perspective as mental health professionals, that really is where we ask parents to like stay firm and say like, no, I'm really worried. Because 99.9% of the time when parents are worried about something, they're not just doing that because they have nothing else to worry about.
There was a comment from somebody about trusting your gut, and I
Yeah.
absolutely believe that. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the tricky thing about eating disorders, or even like before eating disorders start, is you'll hear your teen say a lot of things that you think actually make a little bit of sense. But you kind of have to put your parent hat on and understand that they need the fuel. So for example, I've definitely had kids say like, I just don't have an appetite, or I feel nauseous in the mornings, or, any of those things. So I'm not surprised that that happens when somebody, it's actually, to me, it seems like evolutionarily counterintuitive. But once somebody has started restricting and eating less, their stomach's a muscle, their stomach shrinks. And so now it's not used to eating as much as it used to. The other thing is there's hormones that regulate fullness and hunger that change, like literally change when you start losing weight in a way that makes it easier to lose even more weight, especially in kids that are like predisposed to it. So just because they're not hungry, if your like gut is telling you, okay, you may not be hungry, but this is like even less than what you ate when you were a younger kid, that if something's not right to you, then yeah, it needs to be either discussed, so you can just say like, hey, I noticed that you haven't been, you're more active and you're not eating as much. What's going on? Or talking about like, maybe even if if you're not at the point yet where you're ready to have that conversation, you can see what happens if you go ahead and plate more, and see what the reaction is. That can oftentimes be helpful too. Like if there's a lot of resistance, or there's like food left over on the plate, and then you're like, hey, finish your plate. What's going on? We have a big game tomorrow. And they're still like, nah, I'm fine. Then, I agree. The pediatrician is the best first step. And actually, like, since one of the things as I have like become an attending, after training, that I've sort of realized about pediatricians and physicians in general, especially when dealing with kids, is that I think a lot of times the kids will say like, oh, mom and dad, this is what I hear from parents, like, oh, mom and dad, they're just overreacting. But then when you hear it from a physician sometimes, or a mental health provider, just somebody in like a position of authority, sometimes you need that to kind of get everyone on the same page, like, yes, this is a problem. So it's not necessarily no one's blaming you or anything like that, but it's just so to get everybody on the same page and understanding that this is a problem.
And I think also not in, so we don't forget that it's not all restrictive disorders. That if you're seeing a change where they're jumping up and going to the bathroom right after dinner, or you're seeing changes in patterns of their eating. I also wanted to bring up too, with COVID, I noticed a spike, and not that it hasn't been wasn't any different before, but certainly we noticed some things where kids were concerned about eating certain foods or eating at school with masks. And so kids restricting certain foods can sometimes peel away. So something might trigger, and like, I am not eating, this particular food. And then it becomes more restrictive and more restrictive. So they still want to eat, but now they're like, I can't eat those. They become bad and good foods, or, really like dangerous and fearful for some kids. So I think when we look at the spectrum of all kinds of disorders or all kinds of behaviors, is to think about, are you seeing a change in behavior? Are they being resistant? Like, I feel like for some of even my parents describe, they're so mean or prickly. That's when you have to really lean in and like that's the eating disorder or disordered eating or potential. And here is, what you know of them, and that you're going to have to take charge. And that's the number one thing I feel like words and actions is so hard. Like, oh, they're just, not wanting me to be near them. They're avoiding times to eat. Like, oh, I ate with my friend. All of those things of avoidance is really to think about, and looking, like you said, the gut feeling, really using that and being open about having conversations about it without judgment and curiosity, and then say, no, we're going to go to the doctor because I'm really worried about you. I want to make sure there's not something medically going on.
And I think that's a really good point, Kris.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great point in terms of being non-judgmental and curious, which is that you're really sticking with observations, right? I'm your parent and I've noticed, and again, you're looking for patterns, you're looking for like, not just a one-off time, right? But a pattern of behavior. And you're saying like, here's what I've noticed. I'm worried about you. So it's like an observation, being non-judgmental, expressing concern because you love and care about your kids, right? That's the thing that we feel like is most important as therapists, is that the parents we work with, there's nobody that loves their kids more than they do. And sometimes people feel like they're doing it all wrong or they don't know what to do, but that's okay. And it's because they're in a crisis, but ultimately there's no one that loves your kids more than you do. And so conveying that when you're worried is also important. But then also, to your point, Kris, I think staying firm when someone says, oh no, I'm fine, to say, actually, I'm your mom or your dad or whoever, your trusted adult, and I'm going to take you to the doctor, right? Or I'm going to go and call this person because it's actually my job right now to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to help you with any concerning behavior, right? Whether that would be sleep or depression or anxiety disorders or eating disorders, and that you might get some pushback, but that you are actually doing the right thing. Because if there is no concern, and in fact, you just happen to be worried about something that was no big deal, which again, I would say is pretty rare, then okay, then a trusted professional will tell you that, and then you can move on. But most of the time, parents have a real good sense of when something is up.
So another question that came in, and I think it's one that we received earlier too, is, and there's a couple here that I want to ask, is, where parents are seeing maybe additional weight being put on, and they're feeling like there's some overeating, even though their student might be active. So how do they step in? What is advice for parents when they do see some type of more of a weight gain, or how do they address that with their child? I think this goes tandem with Kris, the conversations at home, where sometimes you'll hear students will say, well, my parents are only this, they only eat that, and they see that and they take that in. What messaging can parents be giving their children on either side? They're gaining weight or they're seeing them being picky eater.
So I'm reading the question that was posted. So first, I would trust the pediatrician. Like, there's a lot of different growth patterns. Not everybody's growth is the same. Some kids their puberty is delayed. Some kids have early puberty. Some kids like shoot up and they gain weight, but their BMI is okay. So if somebody is following their growth curve appropriately and like, I think the question, what I'm saying is, think about if that really is overeating. It might be exactly what their body needs because they're staying on their growth curve. However, the question also talks about patterns of comfort eating. And I guess at that point, it also depends. Like, is this comfort eating like, going out for ice cream with the family after maybe a tough, I don't know, like a tough test or something like that, where it's family time? Or is it more like binge eating where there's like, they're out of control, they can't stop, they're doing it secretly, that sort of thing.
Because one of the other questions that I have on my sheet is it's this idea, how do you encourage your kids to eat healthy and to exercise and do those things without triggering, an eating disorder for the child?
I think,
that's tricky as a pediatrician too. A lot of my residents ask me that. I mean, I think it's just going back to the nutritional guidance that My Plate gives us. It used to be the food pyramid, but now it's My Plate, where, a quarter of your plate is starches and grains, a quarter is protein, and half your plate is fruits and vegetables, and you have a source of dairy. I think it just goes back to talking about balance. Like, you know, like it's great that you're having some pasta and you're having some, like if you had Alfredo, chicken Alfredo, that's a great source of carbs. It's a great source of protein. And then we can just say like, okay, let's get some broccoli in there, like adding something else on to like complete the plate to make it more balanced, is how I would approach it. And thinking about eating as like getting enough, like getting the vitamins and minerals you need to grow appropriately and to get the fuel that you need to do what you want to do. Is that going to be perfect? No, of course not. And I really want to come away from, I don't want anyone to feel like they caused their child to have an eating disorder. Nobody would choose this for their kid or for themselves. So sometimes even if you did all the right things, you may still have a kid with an eating disorder. So I want to also take that stress off of parents a little bit. Like, yes, there are a lot of guidelines that we should follow. Like, let's not use language that is body shaming. Let's not talk about good foods or bad foods. But sometimes it may still happen. And what my job as a pediatrician is to kind of encourage the parents to take control again and teach their kid what not the right, but like teach that it's okay to have a variety of different foods.
And I also, okay.
Oh, go ahead. You can go ahead, Kris, if you want.
No, I think for hearing that too, I think when we talk about healthy eating, I think that again, it gives me a little prickly because it's really about a healthy person. What does it mean? Not just about also by plate, but also everything else that's, surrounding that. So some of that maybe also as parents thinking about, do they have balance in their life that maybe there's an increase of intake and that you're seeing this dip? Is it consistent and persistent over time? And there's a duration of them struggling with, are they self-soothing? Are they seeing like ice cream is like a pleasure? We forget sometimes like, it is a pleasure and it's something that can be pleasurable. It doesn't mean that that's binging or that doesn't mean that that is. So not putting rules around it is something I think is really important. And something else that my students, and I have a little quote from a couple of my students that shared with me is that, and again, no judgment, but just thinking about what you talk about around the house or with them or near them about, oh, well, we can, binge on vacation and we'll get back to our diet. Or, one of the things is like eating light, or we're going to, no sugars or no carbs. And those conversations do sit with kids. They hear it. They hear that, how you like your body or how you don't like your body. And so some of those rules also apply to us in how we interact with our kids.
I also think that it's important to recognize that, I think sometimes we also struggle with the word like healthy and even health because it seems to have been like co-opted by like the wellness industry and like clean eating. And, I always like to tell parents that Kristen and I have like a very particular lens. And so I'm talking about this from my place, like where I work, what I've built my career around. But healthy eating for people is different for everyone. So like this idea that there is one version of what eating needs to look like or should look like is sort of bogus because some people can eat gluten and some people can't. And some people can have peanut M&Ms and some people might die if they ate a peanut M&M. So like thinking about it as sort of one thing that is healthy doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think you want to think about that within like the context of your own kid and your own family and your family's values. And we also know that like eating in response to emotions is a normal behavior. It isn't always pathological. And sometimes we think of it as like very protective, like your primitive brain is trying to protect you by responding in that way. And so we don't always pathologize that. And then I think too, like you want to remember that we eat to fuel our bodies, but we also eat to fuel our souls and have relationships and share culture with each other and, family. So it's not just this idea of like, what I'm putting in my body is to fuel me throughout the day. I mean, we also eat for a ton of other reasons. And so like to remember that even though Cheetos might not have the best nutritional value, well, they're delicious and fun to eat for some people. And that actually is meaningful and has a lot of meaning. So again, thinking about the way that you think about food and then also talk about food in your family, like really getting back to like, well, what do we believe as a family and like how do we value things?
And I guess thinking about how much you're talking about any of these things, right? Like if there's a lot of talking about macronutrients or body shape and size or those, or specific diets in your household, like that does not mean you've caused your young person to have an eating disorder, or they will definitely have an eating. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that might be a point to reflect on, to think about why is there so much conversation, right? Is the conversation around, like, to your point, Sejal, right? Like you're preparing a dinner that has multiple components that allow us to have a really good sensory experience when eating, right? If we only eat plain pasta, it's not very satisfying. Having crunchy broccoli and chicken alongside that and a cream sauce on the pasta, like that's what makes a meal. So part of it is thinking about like how you make those decisions. Some of it might be culturally, right? What you serve for breakfast, lunch, and dinner might relate to, your family of origin or culture that you are a part of. And so I think thinking about all those factors is important. But ultimately, when we see kids not meeting their nutritional needs by either dieting, that can sometimes then cause binge eating to occur, because again, our primitive brain is trying to get us to not lose weight. Or it's kind of hit through that cycle that Dr. Donald was presenting around, the diet has started and weight loss and malnourishment has set in. That's when we don't know that things kind of are off the rails. And then at that point, it's no longer really about those food rules and guidelines. It's about, as Sejal was talking about, like resetting, getting parents to get back into the driver's seat to say, actually, we do know how to feed you and we're going to make sure you're eating enough.
So could you guys share, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's so many proactive things to do too. I know we talked a lot about, kind of the signs and thinking about, but also parents, you have a good sense of looking for things and getting ahead of things. So I know for my students in track season or me for when I coach tennis, but going into a track season coming up, like having conversations about how you're going to do meals, because they're not going to be at home. The snacks are huge. I have students that say, yeah, I'm just doing a granola. I'm going to do a snack right before. Great. What are you having? A granola bar. And they really didn't eat lunch. And so thinking about what their day is going to look like and talking about those nutrients, the things that they're going to take in so that they can have a good, like not only just performance wise, because sometimes kids are really encouraged by that. Like you're going to run better when you have the energy. Any energy out should be more energy in. So I think it's something to think about, getting ahead of things and thinking about what that's going to look like for them in the coming days, them being involved, them eating out with their friends.
Can I add some comments too?
Yeah, sure.
So a few things. Kristen and Sarah talked about dieting. One thing that would be like a red flag to me is if your teenager is on a diet, that even like this is not the time to be doing like keto or those kinds of things, like any of the crash diets or anything like that. Like teenagers need calories to grow, which leads me to my next point, which is that even people in bigger bodies can have eating disorders. Like even if your weight is like normal on the growth curve before and after weight loss, you can still have issues with an eating disorder, including like the complications of malnutrition. So, if your doctor says like, oh, your BMI is higher than such and such percentile, we need to think about healthy eat, like that kind of thing. It doesn't mean that we stop eating altogether. Like that doesn't mean that we're going to start dieting, because again, they're a teenager, they need to be growing. So even people who like, get that kind of advice need to still be eating. And they can also be susceptible to eating disorders. Another thing is just kind of modeling for your kids what you want them to be eating. If your child is not what you want them to be eating, like how you want them to be eating. If they're on the younger side, I think it's developmentally appropriate for you to be the one that's in charge of enforcing an eating routine. So making sure they get breakfast every day, talking to them about making sure that they're eating lunch. I'm noticing that a lot of kids don't eat lunch, and it kind of has sort of like a network effect where one person sees that this person's not eating lunch, so then they stop eating lunch, and then like then we have a problem. So checking in, making sure that your kids are eating lunch, or if they have to make their own lunch, just checking the bag, make sure, kind of providing some oversight once in a while. And then of course having family dinners, having meals together as families, build self-esteem. It's a great time to connect. So again, like just reinforcing that routine can be very, very helpful too, in addition to all the comments and advice that Kristen, Sarah, and Christine and Kris Hummel had.
So one of the last things we wanted to get into is the best practices for treatment, medically, socially, emotionally, and behaviorally, and what are the key factors that predict recovery?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again? I was reading one of the questions.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so no, best practices for treatment, medically, socially, emotionally, and behaviorally, and what are key factors that predict recovery?
So I think
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think one of the things that we know, and this probably just makes good common sense about most conditions, but the earlier that we can treat something, the better the prognosis is, right? So if we catch something early, which again, as we talked about right in the beginning of this presentation, sometimes eating disorders can go, under the radar for some time. And so if you haven't caught it right away, that's actually just part of the illness. It's not, again, anyone's fault, but the sooner we can catch and treat something, again, the better the prognosis is. What we know about, during adolescence is that getting somebody back on their growth curve, especially for restrictive eating disorders, including both ARFID and anorexia, is going to predict generally good outcomes for folks in the 5-year period, which is the typical follow-up data that we have from some of the studies. And that ultimately we know that it's a process, at least from the mental and emotional standpoint, of both nutritional rehabilitation, right? Getting back into a regular routine of eating, whether that's to be able to gain weight or to just not be experiencing binge eating, but sort of a regular schedule of eating, as well as a nice and sort of open range of foods based on preferences and interests and availability rather than rules and guidelines. So making sure that we're both facilitating a process to kind of from a behavioral standpoint, like kind of work eating, but that also serves to challenge some of the rules and guidelines that the eating disorder has. What we also notice, especially in circumstances where someone is undernourished, and again, that doesn't mean, as Dr. Donald was saying, that they have to look underweight, but that their brain is not nourished with the proper nutrition, is that as time goes forward and weight increases or normalizes for the person, that often mood symptoms, depression, anxiety, rumination around food and eating and body shape actually diminishes over time in that process. And I think one of the other factors that we really hold very dear for Sarah and I in terms of the work that we do in our practice is having family members involved, especially parents and again, trusted adult caregivers, because ultimately they have the ability to kind of continue to keep an eye on someone and to know when something might be lapsing in terms of progress. And so that we can kind of keep someone on track in the long run. And so we find that to be very, very valuable.
The one thing I appreciate about all of you is that our goal is to have kids remain home. And that, that if needed residential, but certainly your goal, our goal, in supporting all your work. And so one of the things that we do at Nutria is we, with doctor's note or with a therapist note, indicating that if there needs to be supervised lunches, we realize parents are working and some parents are picking up their kids and understanding that they're wanting to really refeed and get their nutrients in and get them on this plan to be able to start the recovery process. But if we need that, Nutria's been really open about what do you need from us? What are the things that we can do within the confines of a school? What's impacting school functioning? So I work with students because of the fact that I know that they're foggy. I know that they're just getting back to kind of that refeeding. And so thinking about ways that we can support, but ultimately knowing that our goal, our whole treatment goals is to keep kids here at home, and for your focus to be on them getting to a healthier place and in recovery. And we'll do what we can with that realm. And one of the things that I think parents are afraid of is signing a release form so I can talk to the therapist. The greatest gift, I talk to Kristen and Sarah about this all the time. When we get a release and I can talk to all of you, we get a chance to be able to talk about how else can I help in the school setting to be able to encourage and help kids to flourish as best as they can in where they're at.
I think to that point, right, eating disorders really interrupt typical adolescent development. And one of the things that they like to do is make a young person's world very, very small. And so when we're thinking about keeping young people at home with their parents and as engaged with their world as they can be, is really trying to say, no, there's this great big world of life out there. And we want to keep you as engaged in that as we possibly can while we're going through the recovery process. Because again, the eating disorder really likes to say, no, the most important thing in the whole wide world is that you only eat X amount of calories a day. And we want, again, for the young person to be able to see, if possible, right, that there is life beyond.
And to keep the positive parts of life going, right? Like if school, which it often is a place where a young person is thriving, or there's a part of school where they really like a particular teacher, or there's a way that they can stay in their after school club, even if they have to take a pause, from cross country right now, that's a real benefit. There's a benefit to having the school community, especially at a place like New Trier, where you have such wonderful resources and staff and teachers that care so much about the students. Like that sort of wraparound service ends up being very, very valuable versus thinking about, kind of being displaced out of that, which again, there are some circumstances where we do have to recommend pauses from
Sure.
High academic loads or different sports or things like that temporarily, or that even hospitalization is required temporarily from a medical standpoint. But we're really, I think, philosophically working very hard to keep things in the lowest level of care possible, knowing that actually parents are quite capable of delivering quite a high level of care at home, while still maintaining, an outpatient treatment plan.
I will say though, doing this at home doesn't mean that we're less aggressive. So one of the main things about one of the biggest things that helps turn anorexia around, restrictive, eating disorders around, is kind of just to take the rip the band-aid off approach. So it doesn't mean like we take it really, really slow. It doesn't mean we cater to the eating disorder. It doesn't mean that we try to like negotiate with the eating, with the eating disorder or that sort of thing. Like it's still if there is an eating disorder, it can still be challenging, but it just keeps the kid in their same environment. But the most important thing is to get them back on track, to get them weight restored, and then to continue to follow their growth curve. Some of the other things that I think can portend a good prognosis is, some people think that like, oh my gosh, my kid is so young, like there's this too young to have an eating disorder, that sort of thing. Actually, it's okay. The kids that are younger, they can have a good outcome and actually may be helpful because you can reset their thinking patterns. If they've had it for a less amount of time, then it's easier to turn things back around. You have less weight to gain, and also it's just they haven't developed it hasn't become ingrained, the eating disorder. What else are good prognoses? I think in general, I like to put it in a few different categories. Like I think most teens will end up recovering if you end up treating them. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take. So really not being afraid of seeking treatment or not feeling like you failed for any reason. We're just kind of getting things back on track. That's the way that I want to think about it, because it's possible. Yes, it's a vulnerable time, adolescence, but it's also a time of incredible brain plasticity. So we want to leverage that and get things back on track as quickly as possible. Can you repeat the question again? I want to make sure I'm answering every single part of the question.
No problem. It's just, practice best practices for treatment, medically, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, and what are key factors that predict recovery?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of just like being firm and doing it and realizing that your kid is it's not gonna be easy. It's not gonna be easy for your kid. They may have a lot of concerns about, what it looks like socially, what it looks like in relationships, that sort of thing, what it looks like physically, but you you are the adult, you are the parent, so they need you to kind of absorb some of that anxiety and let them kind of over time figure it out. You know that they're going to be fine, as long as we get them nutritionally, medically back on track. Because if you don't have your physical medical health, you don't have anything.
Yeah.
It's hard to achieve if, like Kris was saying, if you're in a brain fog all the time. This may be the smartest kid ever, but you can't help that. That's just the way your body works.
And they end up working so much harder to try and keep the grades, even though like staying up to midnight or staying up to one. And so it becomes really, that they end up getting so down on themselves that they can't keep up, and it becomes really impactful over their mental health, starting with the anxiety, trying to be perfectionistic potentially, and I guess increasing the amount of symptoms that they end up having. And what I have noticed with my students, sometimes we're the first conversation because of somebody's concerned about a student. And when I talk to students, I ask them, how frequently do you think about food? Now, this is in a context of a lot of other things that I talk about with regards to their whole existence. But, they kind of start talking about food or about their body, and they will say it trails back to fifth grade, fourth grade in their thoughts. How frequently, and what sticks with me, and kids will say, well, they kind of like they don't know what the norm is. Like, isn't this normal? Because they're living in it, and they think of food, think of their body, think of how they feel in their body and how their body feels on their clothes, multiple times a class, multiple times. So I think when you think about having conversations now, if it's not a disordered eating situation, is that you don't suspect, is really to start having conversations about maybe thinking about, what do you think about, what are your thoughts that you have about your body? We all have negative times that we think about different things, whether it's our body or the way we exist in the world and our relationships in different places, and kind of that vulnerability, and having your kids talk about those feelings, because adolescence is one of the ripest times for all of those factors, socially, emotionally, behaviorally. And in thinking about that, I know, Denise, you're going to talk about a little bit, or want us to talk about a little bit about what Nutria is doing, but I think some of the things we try to do is really help kids to recognize those signs, recognize the warning, identify ways to be able to intervene. And I don't want to jump to that question, but
okay. We've got a couple minutes left, so we can go there. I mean, I think it's important to discuss some of the things and the way in which we're educating our students in the various places in the building to support their health.
Yeah. So number one, I told everybody that I would let parents know that we do have a group that is a recovery group. And I'm really careful about making sure that we have students in recovery for an educational support group. I just think it's important to know that oftentimes kids don't want to talk, like somebody's going to know about this just eating disorder. And it is probably one of those powerful groups. They have a chance to connect to somebody, have a community of people who have struggled, and that we make sure they're in recovery so they don't trigger one another and continue to increase or perpetuate those things. So certainly that's one piece I wanted to share. We also I'm really grateful that we have, that Nutria is open to really thinking about, and like even this webinar, what we have in place are certain crisis procedures that every single staff member, I'm talking about security and PPS, has been trained on how to intervene, and self-harm is one, but we also have eating disorders and substance use. So staff know what to say or how to intervene. I mean, we've had times where somebody was looking at a student who was really concerned about how their gait was walking down the hall, and literally followed them to be able to get that support and help for that student, or at least to be able to have a conversation with them and or their parents. We also in the KW mental health first aid is something new in sophomore health. So they talk about how to recognize signs, whether it's for themselves or others, and then also how to get and refer somebody for help. So I think there's a lot of things that don't, there's many more things that we do here at New Trier, but most of all, I just want to open up that, for me at New Trier, that's something that I really want parents to know is it's better to call and to start to have the conversation for me to connect you to outside supports than feeling like, okay, I'm in this alone. And that's certainly not the case. And I'm sure Kristen and Sarah and Dr. Denawala would agree that it's better just to kind of might as well check and be secure in checking.
Right. I mean, I think that's probably the one thing that, compared to some other medical concerns and conditions and diagnoses, eating disorders still carry a lot of stigma. And I think when we talk to parents, every day on the phone, I think hopefully one of the things that we're able to do, even just on our phone intake, is to remind people that they're not alone. The stories that we hear, there are so many commonalities. And again, we attribute that to the consistency among these disorders, really, because obviously the families we talk to are all very different and come from lots of different places all around Illinois. But I think ultimately, people are not alone, and there's not, there is still a stigma with mental health, but hopefully that is changing. And I think that's actually a real benefit of the adolescence that we see is so many things are changing related to mental health stigma and asking for help and letting people know when you're not okay and sort of normalizing the fact that people struggle with things. And that's actually a very normal part of being a human, and that you can reach out to people for support. And so I think ultimately, definitely asking for help is going to shine a light on then actually being able to have a treatment plan forward. I think there are times when people think, oh gosh, if I go and I call my doctor, then they're going to get a label and then I'm going to start this whole thing. And again, actually what you're going to be doing is getting your kid the help that they need. And if there's no help that's needed, we're always very happy to tell someone, to go on their way. That doesn't happen very often, sadly, but when it does, we're like, no, everything's fine. And that's great. And so again, don't be afraid to reach out. But there are some resources I think we've provided to New Trier, and I know, Kris, you have that, in terms of online, there's a lot of different things that parents can read. Yeah. There's national hotlines. There's obviously like private practices like ourselves or like the office at New Trier that you can call, but ultimately there's a lot of different avenues to get information.
And I want to mention that was your kid. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you can't get your young person to buy in, like we work with a lot of parents initially first. So like, again, whether you want to have a phone call or a consultation with us, like that's something that we can also do if you're like, I don't know how to do this with my kid. We're happy to do those things.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kris. Sorry.
No, Kris.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's really huge. I think parents at first step of feeling not confident, in how do I go about this? Yeah. And I'm hearing a lot of that in the chat and also in the questions that we had. But I think for all of you to know that, I might have missed my point, but all of you to know that it's, it's okay to reach out and just try to troubleshoot or problem solve anything, whether it's with the nurse or any one of our staff members that, I know that we do the best we can with all of the information we receive from kids and trying to follow up with parents. If we get tips or anything, we do end up following up with you all. But if you have concerns and we need to kind of take a look at and share our opinion or what our thoughts are, we're happy to do that.
I love that part about being able to reach out as an adult first to some of you, because I think all of us could use advice in working through this. And I did see some questions in there about, I think this is going on and my child is not acknowledging it, or I'm not able to have that conversation. So I think you all bring a wealth of information and advice that I think would really be beneficial as parents work through some of this. So we're at the very end of the webinar. I can't thank you guys all enough. I've got, received several positive texts on my phone over here who've been attending, some of our parents. So thank you all for taking the time to be here and for the support you've given to not only New Trier, but our students in our community on this very important topic. So thank you all. You can look on our website, and Kris, it'll be under your page. Is that what we said?
I think so. It's
Yeah.
Parent Support Network newsletter, or they can go under Parent PSN.
Yep. So we'll put we'll put the webinar here on there, and then we'll add make sure we have those resources that Kristen, you were sharing.
Yeah, if there's any questions that we can answer more specifically in writing or in an email, we're very happy, to do that.
Yeah.
We'll take a look at some of the questions that were submitted, and if we didn't get to them, maybe we can point you in the right direction of some of the best practice answers, because all the questions that were asked, there were so many of them. They're all very common questions. So you guys are, again, you're not alone. And thank you very much for inviting us to speak.
Yeah. All right.
Thank
well,
you.
thank you, everyone.
Appreciate
Thank you, everybody,
everybody.
for attending.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so
Great
much.
Thank you.